All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mic'd in New Haven podcast, episode 121. If you have not checked out the previous episode, by the time you're seeing this one, you will have, I hope. That was volume 7 of the best of the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite with retired FDNY firefighter Tim Brown. And that, I have to tell you, is one of the more emotional interviews I've recorded. It was a great show. Tim talked about the many years he worked in the FDNY, particularly working in Rescue 3 in the Bronx, and some of the interactions, the final interactions he would have with some men who we saw in the lobby of the World Trade Center who he worked with and loved very much in the FDNY, who he'd never see again. So if you haven't checked out that episode, please go do so. You will not regret it. And you won't regret this one either, with episode 121 from the FDNY. Now back to the NYPD with my next guest, who is a woman who specializes in social media communication, a native of Israel. Her experiences in the Israeli army would serve as a foundation of her later experiences in her field of choice. And not to mention, of course, a BA in counterterrorism back in Israel. She's also a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School. And yet, after immigrating to the United States in 2007, ran the NYPD social media accounts from 2014 right at until the start of last year, 2020. Still hard at work as a social media consultant. She has her own company, and that is Yael, who joins me now on the Mike Maven podcast. I hope I said that correctly. Yael, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Doing good. Good to have you here. So the first question is easy. I know you grew up in Israel. Take me through what growing up in Israel was like.
Well, so I did grow up in Israel. I was born in Tel Aviv. I spent 4 years of my life in Australia between the ages of 4 and 8. So I kind of got to see what life was like outside as well. But growing up in Israel for us, it just felt very normal. Everything about it, same things as growing up here. You have your friends and you have your social life and your parents and your hobbies and the beach and all that good stuff. But it is kind of with the threat of war always. So once in a while, for me, when I was growing up, there was a Gulf War, something that impacted our lives, and then different bouts of terrorism attacks. But it's something, it sounds strange, but it's something that becomes somewhat manageable, and you try to lead a normal and good life. And, I think I had a fairly happy childhood.
So, I mean, you were growing up too during the height of the Arafat era, when he was not the chairman of Israel, but obviously the chairman of Palestine, which he was a guy that was quite complicated, to say the least. And that is, if you want to go back and listen to my interview with Ashley Banfield, she talks about interviewing him at the end of his life in 2002. And yeah, he was an interesting character, to say the least. So you were growing up during also the internet revolution in the 90s, when Al Gore's internet, as we have the joke here, was taking off. And so during that time, given what you have later taken up as a career field, I imagine that had to have interested you more than most kids.
Yeah, I was very excited when it started. I remember when somebody came to our classroom from IOL, which was Israel Online, which I guess was a subsidiary of AOL, and gave us floppy disks with Messenger on it. And it was very cool, and very quickly opened up a new world to me. But it also very quickly you saw, the positive and the negative. So I, was chatted with people, made a lot of great friends through that, but also experienced trolling and, kind of the regular things that we see today. But it was fun to grow up with it and really be able to remember life before and after. So, when I was in high school, there was no Wikipedia, for example. But later on in college, maybe there was a little bit more of that. So it's kind of interesting to be able to know the world before and after the internet.
If you were trolling in the 90s, you're a real OG. Like, imagine the effort it would take in like 1998 to troll somebody. Like, that's hard work.
There was this girl, we had a chat room. I'll never forget this. There was this girl, and she was so cool. She was like older, maybe like 17. And her name was Sky, which was not a name in Israel. And I remember just her being so cool. And then one day we were all in this chat room, and one day it was like exposed that, she's just a regular girl like us, and her name isn't even Sky. And we were shook. So yeah, that bubble burst pretty fast.
And there you go. We're talking with the Yael here on the Mike Maven podcast. This is episode 121. So, you served in the Israeli army for a while. And for context for my listeners who may not understand foreign policy, I believe this is still the case in Israel. Military service is a requirement. At least once you come of age, you reach the age of 18. Even if you don't go to war necessarily, you have to at least offer some sort of service to the Israeli military. So, in the military, the theme is relatively the same, whether it's in America, Israel, or anywhere else for that matter. Discipline, structure, discipline. How do you feel that shaped you, not just for obviously your career field, but also your life?
Yes, so like you said, it is mandatory in Israel, and you start it's similar to how you go to college here. So you start about a year before in high school, applying for different units, going through different tests, and you can really choose anything you want or try to be anything you want, from a fighter pilot to an actor in the IDF theater. And I was always interested in communications, obviously still am. So I tried out for the spokesperson unit and went through a series of exams and tests, and finally got in and had training for that specific role. And I was assigned to be a foreign press liaison. So this was early 2000. And at the time, it was a very sleepy unit, the foreign press, because there wasn't much going on in Israel. But as soon as I started, the second intifada began, and you had correspondents coming in from all over the world to cover the conflict in Israel. So really thrown into the water at a pretty young age, and it was exciting. I don't think I understood the magnitude of it at the time. Like I said, it's very common, so that you're doing something and all your friends are doing something similar as well. So it doesn't necessarily seem that unique. But once you leave the country and you talk to other people, you realize that, I've had experiences that have definitely shaped me and just put things into perspective in terms of, service and public safety, and, instances where you have to talk about what's going on. You have to talk to the media, but you're also dealing with very sensitive issues.
Before we dive deeper, just for my listeners who may not be familiar, can you describe what exactly an intifada is?
Sure. So the intifada started in 2000. It was a violent uprising in the West Bank and Gaza, and it was a series of attacks, a lot of terrorist attacks that were happening on buses, in malls and restaurants in Israel. And Israel is a very, very small country. It's about the size of New Jersey. So there's really no place to hide from it, and no place to, that's considered technically, safer than others. So it is something that's always in the back of your head whenever you board a bus in Israel. I would take the bus every day from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem during my service. And if you saw somebody that didn't look right, you just get off the bus. You saw somebody with a big bag or something like that. Or you try to avoid very crowded buses, try to avoid buses inside Jerusalem, so more like local commuter buses, because they are getting attacked. And it's pretty much the most horrific thing you can imagine when that happens. Men, women, children, Arabs, Jews, anybody, if you're in the wrong place in the wrong time, can be a casualty of this terrorism.
I can't even imagine what that's like. I mean, and I'm sorry you had to go through that, but working as an Army press liaison, and you have foreign press coming in. Now, some of these people are very seasoned war correspondents. They've just about seen it all, so you don't have to tell them anything. You're preaching to the choir. But for that first time reporter, for somebody who hasn't been there that often, maybe the only time they've ever been there is just to cover a summit, and now you're the press liaison talking with them. What were if I could speak English, that'd be great. What would those kind of conversations consist of? Because you have your point of view, and obviously they're a newbie. So what would you try to tell them about your homeland and how you guys operated?
Yeah, it's really tough to try to understand the Middle Eastern conflict. I think sometimes even the seasoned reporters get it wrong because there's just so much going on. I think it was very, very difficult. I think the only way to really explain it is to be on the ground and experience it. When I was a little older, when I was graduating from college, I was drafted into reserve duty. This was during the war with Lebanon in 2006. So by then I was a little more experienced and seasoned. So I was more comfortable, talking to reporters and kind of trying to realize what their experiences were. And it's interesting. You get a mixed bunch of people. But I think everybody that goes to the region to cover it, it leaves some sort of impact on them.
Absolutely. And that brings us to 2007, and when you came to the United States. And this is during a time when there's war going on here. America, they're still at war in one instance, the other war just ended. And that is the height of the war on terrorism and the conflicts over there that they're involved in the Middle East. And here you come. So what made you want to come to America? Was it schooling? Was it some other opportunity you wished to pursue?
So I always loved the US. I had cousins here. And for us, and I think this is true for a lot of countries, we really look to the US as kind of, the where the dreams are, right? I mean, the American dream is alive and well, at least outside of the US for a lot of immigrants. So I was always fascinated by American culture. I grew up on American music and TV, and probably a lot of similar things that any contemporaries of mine here in the US grew up on. And I always wanted to come to America. And then I went to visit. And once I got to New York City, I remember being like, yeah, this is it. This feels right. So I kind of, left home and said goodbye to my family and went on a journey. And I didn't know at the time that I would be here this long. I thought maybe at some point I'd go back, and I still love Israel very much. I just came back. My family is there. It's my home. But this is my home too.
Absolutely. And I always ask this to somebody that didn't originally grow up in America and has to come here now. The adjustment period. There's Israeli, even though it may not be that different, there's Israeli customs nonetheless, and there's American customs. And it can be a little bit of an eye opener to where even something down, as I had this conversation with Ashley Banfield, because she's originally from Canada, this candy's different, something like that. It might be so small, but to you, it's like, whoa, wait a minute. So how long did it take you to adjust to here?
That's a good question. So like I said, I grew up on a lot of American culture, and I was lucky to work for, when I came to live in the US, my first job was for the Israeli government. So I got to kind of be in a hybrid environment. But there's definitely things that still, that still surprise me, or that are still new to me. I think every Halloween, we just had Halloween, every Halloween there is some candy that I try that I never had before. That is very, very exciting to try. And then, some things, or people will mention or refer to something from their childhood, like a TV show, and I'll be like, what's that? And they'll look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what you've never heard of,
SpongeBob?
SpongeBob? I have heard of SpongeBob.
Good. So I would end this podcast
so
otherwise.
Once in a while, there'll be something like that just completely skipped over us in Israel. And then there are a little bit of cultural differences too. So, I think Israelis are maybe a little more direct than Americans. And, I try to tone it down a little bit. But sometimes it's definitely a bit of a difference in culture.
Well, Israelis and Hispanics, I'm Hispanic, so it's not that different. Believe me, we are a blunt society too, as my mother will tell you. She leaves nothing left unsaid, which has left me like, if you ever see that Speaking of SpongeBob, that episode where Squidward's trying to direct the band and then the sticks come flying at him and he's hanging on the wall. No. It's basic. That's basically when my mother said something sharp and blunt. That's how I look at the end of it. So,
and we also want to feed everyone around us. So
that too. So you picked up a BA in counterterrorism, as I was mentioning when I was introducing you. And, again, when you got here, we're not that far removed from 9/11. There have been instances of terrorism, both domestic and foreign, in the 90s with the 93 World Trade Center bombing, the embassy bombings in 98, McVeigh's bombing in Oklahoma City in 95. So picking up that, it's apropos for the time. Understanding terrorism is unique from your perspective, given the way you grew up, but nonetheless, for a country that we're still trying to come to terms with what had happened in 2001, take me through some of the more eye-opening lessons that you discovered while getting your BA for counterterrorism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was always interested in counterterrorism. I still am, especially in the forces that shape people's decisions. One of the first things that you learn in counterterrorism, and I studied from some of the most incredible teachers from all over the world who were affiliated with the Institute for Counterterrorism in Israel. But one of the first things we talked about is that terrorism is usually a very rational decision. So it's not something where somebody just, the type of terrorism, at least that we are dealing with, it's not necessarily somebody just loses it or flips, where it might be in a kind of more lone wolf situation. But for organized terrorism and the kind that we see in the Middle East, and the kind that you saw here in 9/11, a lot of it is very rational. It's actually the result of a decision that is being made to garner some kind of political support. And it was very, very eye-opening for me. And when we've been through so many terrorism attacks in Israel, I've seen so many of them. But when 9/11 happened, I was in the army in Israel, and it was just a whole different level. Even though it didn't happen to us in Israel, I think as Israelis we were shocked. We didn't realize it could get to come to America. So that definitely shaped my decision to study and kind of see how what causes people to commit these acts. And I was very interested in the communications aspect of it as well. So the propaganda around it, and the type of, I wrote a paper about kind of the violent images that are shown to young children in some of these magazines or school, material that incite them towards violence, with very, very graphic and violent material. And it's sad. It's unfortunately, I think, a long cycle that can't be stopped like this. But hopefully, one day it will be a generation that won't know it at all.
Yeah, and the thing for me that I ask, through interviews with people like yourself, and as I mentioned before, interviews with my friends from the Bomb Squad for the miniseries I have profiling them, I can understand on its face, okay, if you're, and I'm not a political person, I don't really have a side because I am abreast of what's going on, but I'm not really, I don't take sides in it because it's toxic. But I can understand on its face if you don't want America in a certain country. Like if you live in a certain country and you see what's going on and all the chaos that's unfolding because of a given conflict, saying, well, why are they here? Why can't they just go back there? Look at all I have to endure. That's understandable. But where it shifts from that understandable frustration to, I'm going to hijack a plane and fly it into a building, or I'm going to plant a bomb here and whoever dies, dies.
Yeah.
Well,
terrorism is very psychological, right? So it's not as if the World Trade Center falling would ruin the American economy or even the American, infrastructure. But the idea, the goal is to cause terror, to create a fear, to create a feeling that will kind of shift the entire nation. And in order to achieve that psychological fear, your goal is to commit some of the most horrific crimes and just to instill as much disaster and heartache as possible. And it's a very rational decision. Unfortunately, it's a tactic. It's a tactic meant to dissuade public opinion. Unfortunately, I don't think it's very effective. So I think going to the negotiation table would be much more effective for both sides. But sadly, it is designed to do exactly that. It is designed to cause the heartbreak and the emotional kind of distress that the nation will experience after.
Absolutely. And this is Yael Beltour here on episode 121 of the Nypd podcast. Happy to have her. So as far as that BA, last known encounter terrorism, picking it up, you running the NYPD social media accounts, which we'll get to a little bit later. The NYPD has its own counterterrorism bureau, and I believe their tweets come from the NYPD CT handle. So when it comes to that aspect of your work, How helpful has that BA been, or was it? Because obviously you're not going to know the ins and outs of the operation. Certain things need to remain classified. But in order to get some form of the message out, how did that BA come to your aid?
Yeah, actually, it is sort of how I accidentally got into the NYPD. When I was at the Kennedy School, I had made friends with some two officers that were studying with me. Then both have since retired, Ron Willamy and Jack Jasker, and I didn't know much about the NYPD, but when I learned about it through them, I really wanted to take an internship, and I initially really wanted a counterterrorism internship. And unfortunately, I couldn't get that one. So I was offered an internship in the kind of strategic arm of the NYPD. And that's how I eventually got into communication and messaging. So counterterrorism was coincidentally my first step as I tried to go into the NYPD. And then within the NYPD, I always had a special affinity for the counterterrorism unit. I loved the chief there, and we had a great relationship with them, and they were also very much involved in social media, very much involved in trying to do outreach to the community, and always had a special place in my heart. I don't know if it's because of the people there, but probably a combination of that, and also just me being Israeli, the sight of those men and women always made me feel safe.
And aside, the counterterrorism is now run by my friend John Miller, who does a great job with it. But it used to be run by David Cohen, who I just want to say you should probably come on this show, David. Just saying, I'm trying to get him on it. So hopefully he can.
Have you had John Miller on?
I have. He was my 100th episode.
Oh, that's great. That I need to go watch that. I'm sure that was a great interview.
Oh, it was. Yeah, that man has led a life.
He's got some stories.
He does, for sure. So the Harvard Kennedy years, before we dive deeper and get back into your years with the NYPD, American education versus Israeli education. I hate to make the question sound redundant, but nonetheless, although most of it, I imagine, had to be similar, in an institute like Harvard, just tell me about, again, the experiences you had and the great lessons that you learned, not just the great lessons, but what I'm sure the great people that you had there teaching you those lessons, and how much of an impact they had and still have on your life.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll confess here, I'm not a great student. I was never ever the student who, I was a student who scrambled in the morning to finish all the assignments and do all the readings and just try to get by. I love learning, but I'm not what you would think of as an academic. So I think the Kennedy School was a great choice because it's a lot more practical than academic. And it was an incredible 2 years. I look back, it's been almost 10 years. I still can't believe that I went there. It seems, crazy to me. And the level of the courses is, look, microeconomics in Israel College and microeconomics at Harvard are going to be the same microeconomics, right? What's really, really amazing about the Kennedy School and similar schools is the access that you get to people. So when you're studying your class about media, it is taught by, the New York Times Washington bureau chief. Or one of my favorite classes that I took was Megan O'Sullivan, who worked for the Bush administration. It was about the Iraq and Afghanistan war. And Megan is amazing as a teacher, but I also had next to me in class, a guy who was a Pakistani journalist who covered Afghanistan, and a guy who was a Special Forces US military commander. And the access you get to not just the practitioners that are teaching you, but also the students and the people around you, it is really the added value.
Absolutely. And so getting that, obviously, forays into, like I said, your internship with the NYPD, and then getting to 2014 to where outreach is very, very important. I felt, and I'm not knocking Commissioner Kelly because he did a great job, and I think he's one of the best commissioners the NYPD's ever had, but he was more close to the vest with how he chose to operate things, and he was the guy that was getting the message out there. And that's why many of the guys that work.
Yeah,
absolutely. And social media was around. Twitter was around, Facebook, Instagram, but not to the extent and popularity that it has today,
Yeah.
to where now it's 2014. Bill Bratton's in. Bill Bratton's been more of a transparent guy. Again, another great commissioner New York City has been very fortunate to have. And nonetheless, that leads to you getting the opportunity to increase that outreach. Because when we look at the police, and I say this as someone that obviously is not anti-police, but it's kind of like, okay, they're their agency, and you don't really think of them as being the cool kids because you're taught as a kid, don't do the kind of things that would draw their attention. But you realize,
yeah. Or if you're bad, or the cops always hate it when parents say, if you're bad, I'll tell the police.
Right, because that fosters a negative relationship. And I say this as someone with cops in my family who I love, and it's so now you're in charge of showing people what is already known, but hey, we're human beings. You like the Knicks, for example? Oh, I like the Knicks too. Let's talk about Knicks basketball. Something as simple as that. So you want to make sure that you're running it in a manner that gets key information out there. An example being that truck attack back in 2017, but also allows for a little bit of levity, a little bit of humor and playing around and even being in on the joke, if you will. So what were, I guess, the bulletin points you had in your head for, okay, here's where the NYPD social media accounts now are in 2014. By 2016, here's where I want to have it.
Yeah. So my goal was, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but actually when I was after my internship at the Kennedy School, when I went back for my second year, I wrote together with a classmate of mine, we wrote our graduate thesis on specifically how the NYPD should implement social media. So I kind of came, with a blueprint of what I wanted to implement. And very, very fortunate to have Commissioner Bratton, who really was open to decentralized communication. So the goal was first and foremost to decentralize and to make sure that every precinct commander has a voice in their own community. So we gave every precinct commander a Twitter account. We then rolled out Facebook accounts and also initiated a new role in NYPD, which is a role of the digital communications officer. So it is a role, it's additional duties to an officer that is designated by their precinct commander. And that officer will be trained on digital communications and run the social media account. So getting the decentralized thing off the ground was the most important. We did that within a few years. And it's not just a matter of handing people the keys and saying, you're doing this now, because cops are very good at doing kind of what they're told. But the input and the buy-in was really important to me, because I knew if this is just another thing that they have to do now, then they're not going to do it well and they're not going to enjoy it. And my goal was always to have it so this tool makes life easier for them and not harder. So training was something very important where, we emphasized to the officers how this could help them connect with their communities, build trust, engage. So the decentralized part was one of it, was a big part of it. And then the other thing that you alluded to was humanizing, right? So there are 36,000 police officers in the city, and not a lot of people know them. And we really wanted to show that personal side, and that was never really done before. So we wanted to show, like you said, that they like sports, they have hobbies, they come from different countries, they speak different languages, and demystify them a little bit and make them more accessible, more approachable to people through social media. Because unfortunately, and we see it a lot today, people still see police officers as them, right? Us versus them. And I really wanted to break that them a little bit and see that, these are men and women in your community and just very, very different backgrounds and hopes and dreams, just like everybody else.
Because unfortunately, previously, how would we learn about an individual cop? Either A, this cop's accused of doing something bad, or B, they died in the line of duty.
Yeah.
And that's how we're learning about them. Whereas, for example, you would want to see something like I saw recently. It was a video of a cop in a neighborhood walking around. I think Stranger Things was filming there. And he was talking about his love for the show. This is a little while ago, and something like that. Like it just, and I guess he was a good looking guy, I must say. And so the women underneath were, can he do videos more often? And for as sappy as that sounds, hey, that's an avenue into a unique human being, and B, a better understanding of your precinct.
It's really important. And I'll tell you something more than that even. at some point, the heroic stuff that police officers do, we definitely want to put that out there. But, you know, when a cop saves somebody's life or even delivers a baby, it's a wonderful thing, but it's not as interesting to people because it's what's expected of police officers. The most interesting things and some of our most viral stories were the ones that were really unexpected and the ones where the police officer showed a bit of humanity that you didn't expect from them. And one of my favorite stories that we had was a police officer in Times Square who helped a woman out. She was a tourist from Ireland and she was in line to get Hamilton tickets, which were the hottest tickets in town. Yeah. And she was standing in line for days upon days and eventually got to the front of the line, realized she was short $20. This was her, you know, now or never moment, ran to the police officer to try to ask for an ATM or something. And as many officers do, he just saw a woman in distress, needed $20. It's like, here's $20, never thought of it again. You know, when I called him to ask him about it, he had almost forgotten. And that story, when we kind of packaged it and told that story and, you know, showed kind of how the impact that a small moment has on someone's life, it was international news. So I think people react really well to those moments where you just don't, you know, you don't necessarily expect that type of kindness or behavior from anyone. And it's nice to see it.
Absolutely, because it's not what you do when the cameras are rolling. It's what you do when no one's looking. You know, that's what people appreciate because that is who you truly are. You know, if you're acting and you're putting on basically a facade, you know, people are going to read, especially in a city like New York, where they call out BS real quickly, as you well know.
And on social media.
Right. You'll see right through that. And so, you know, in terms of this is a two-pronged question I want to ask you. In terms of staying active equally on all platforms, like, listen, I'm on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn a lot, but I'm not really on, I hate Facebook. I don't have Facebook. But when I was on it, I wasn't active. So making sure you're active on every single platform, because not everybody has all the different social media apps downloaded to their phone. How much of a challenge was that to make sure the message gets out just as equally as it would on Twitter, as it would on Facebook, as an example?
Yeah. So I think the most important thing is doing it incrementally because you don't want to start on everything. You really only want to be where you can maintain. So if all you can do is Instagram, then do that and do it well. So that's my philosophy, at least, is not to try to be everywhere at once if you can't manage it. If you don't want all the platforms to suffer and just produce like a mediocre content for all of them when you could just be focused on one. We chose to start with Twitter because Twitter is the most newsworthy platform. So it's actually very small. People don't realize that Twitter isn't even in the top 10, I think, of social media platforms in terms of reach and growth. But it is very prominent because a lot of media is on Twitter and a lot of politicians are on Twitter. So we started with Twitter and then eventually rolled out Facebook. If it was up to me, you know, the precincts would also be on Instagram and Nextdoor and everything else. But unfortunately, you know, we just didn't want to spread them too thin. And then the other thing is, too, we didn't want to open too many different accounts. And we had, by the time I left NYPD, we probably had about 120 unique accounts. So, you know, if adding up Twitter and Facebook, it's over 200, but 130 or so unique accounts. And even that was too much. And a lot of my biggest wins at NYPD was convincing people that they don't need a social media account. Or, you know, because people would say like, hey, I need a Twitter for my unit. And you'd ask them why. And they say, well, I have an event that I need to promote. I'm like, okay, well, let's figure out how we can promote it through existing channels, as opposed to you opening up a Twitter for your very specialized unit, having 40 followers, and then not being able to maintain it after your event is over. So a lot of it was just also not diluting the pool too much.
I got to ask about this too, because if you have, for example, I know you mentioned precincts having their own Twitter accounts. Mm-hmm. If you have that really old school commander who I
Yeah.
love because those are the cops I'm talking to often on this show. The
Yeah.
ones like, kid, you should have seen me in the 80s and the 90s
Yeah.
when I was doing this, that, and the other. And it's like they're anti-social media
We call them
basically.
dinosaurs.
Right. So I was trying to be nice, but you're blunter than I in that sense. For that commander that's just like, what is this? That barely even knows how to use their email. How would you convince them? No, this is a good idea.
Yeah. So, well, those were some of my favorite people to work with, because it was fun to see them, a lot of them turn around, and I always told them, look, you don't need to like this. It's okay. You don't need to be in love with it. I'm not in love with it. All you need to do is recognize it as a really, really useful tool for you. And if you're smart, which a lot of them are, you find that person in your command that you can delegate to and reap the benefits. And it's interesting, actually, a lot of the older guys, I would say, weren't as hesitant because they were more seasoned, and they realized that policing is evolving and changes, and you need to adapt to new things. And sometimes the younger commanders were more hesitant just because they were a little more risk averse, right? So they played it safe a little more and didn't want the danger of being on social media, because it can be a double-edged sword. So some of my favorite people to work with are, some of the more seasoned officers. One of our best accounts, I don't know if you know Chief Joe Fox. If you don't, you should have him on the show.
I haven't yet, but I know.
He's definitely of a certain generation. Let's put it that way. He was our chief of transit, and he was his account was one of the best because he, cooperated with the right people, and he was a huge advocate of social media, even though it wasn't something that was necessarily natural to him, but he saw how it benefited his officers and his community.
And even the current transit chief, who I think is Kathleen Riley, if I have that correct, she's great with it too. Like, she's
Wonderful.
Very funny. She's witty.
Yeah.
So she's an absolutely great follow. Like, she'll make a joke at the criminal's expense. He was a second-time offender. Did he think this was a great idea? Yes. Was it? No. Like something like that. I'm like, hey, I like that.
She's wonderful. She was chief of Manhattan North, where I live, and always been just a wonderful presence in the NYPD.
So when you have the aspect of trolling, nobody likes to get trolled. That's why, for example, when I promote my podcast pretty much, occasionally on Twitter, but most of the time I'm promoting it on LinkedIn because I can contain the people that I have connecting with me. Whereas with Twitter, it's the wild, wild west. So my cop episodes, or even somebody like yourself that worked with the police, I don't like promoting those. Why? Because I don't need to catch a stray, from somebody that's more on the anti side. And I'm like, okay, this is not what I'm looking for. Yeah. And I feel bad for Dermot Chase sometimes, because my generation, me being 21, we call it like two things. Either you're catching a ratio.
21?
Yes.
I know you said I'm not allowed to curse, but
don't. I'm
like, wow, good for you.
Thank you. I'll be 22 in February. So like my generation, we call it two things. Either A, you're getting a ratio, or B, you're getting put in a pack. And Dermot will tweet something that's really good, and I'm like, hey, and then I see the quote tweet ratio to retweet. I'm like, Dermot, poor Dermot, you're getting put in the pack right now.
Yeah, comes with the territory, right?
So with that, tell me about dealing with the trolls.
Oh, so on a personal level or a professional level, or
professional both? For the NYPD, because listen, when these things happen, even if it's something that the NYPD didn't do, it happened in a different police agency in a different part of the country, like we saw last year. People got mad at the NYPD. I'm like, wait a minute, they weren't in Minnesota. Why are you mad at them?
Yeah, it reminds me of there was one time a few years ago when there was an issue with the Portland police in Oregon, and I went to the Portland, Maine Facebook page, their police department, and their Facebook page had a message there that said, please stop harassing us. This is Portland, Maine, not Portland, Oregon. So there's no way to escape it. Like you said, the chief police commissioner gets ratioed. Everybody, it happens to everybody from time to time, but the more prominent you are, I think the more of a chance you have that it will happen to you. I can tell you that it's not easy. So it does feel personal, and every police officer, everybody that I worked with, when they get trolled, whether or not it's their fault, sometimes people will post something and you're like, oh, I can't believe you posted that. And sometimes people will post something that is completely fine and still get trolled. And I'll give you an example. We had a police captain in Staten Island who had a group of kids that were basically just terrorizing the neighborhood with bicycles. So they were taking, they were riding through traffic and riding through cars and almost causing accidents. And it was just something that her community was complaining about a lot, because it was really causing some kind of disorder, even though these were teenagers, but still very dangerous. And they eventually they caught up to these kids, and they confiscated the bikes. And she posted it on social media, and she got dragged because bicycle advocacy is a really big topic on social media. And I called her up and I said, look, I know, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but you did the right thing, because this is what your community wants to hear. The community is coming to you. They're saying, we have a problem with this. You're acting on that. And you could see in the comments, you'd see the ones that are people from the neighborhood saying, thank you. And then people from, Seattle saying, or whatever. So you have to always anticipate a certain level of trolling, but try to avoid it, but also don't let it stop you from doing your job, right? If every police officer didn't act because they were afraid of what somebody might say, which, some might argue is happening now, you get a kind of a different environment. So always put your standards, your job, your safety first, but then try to also avoid any unforced errors.
I had this conversation with a friend of mine, Allie Bauman, who's a reporter for Channel 2, who was on the show a couple episodes ago. I remember her doing a story recently on the NYPD doing a gang takedown in the Wagner houses. So people who, they were young, they're around my age, and it's sad that they're going down this path and not making the right choices. And you hope that the ones who are accused of lesser crimes can have a wake-up call and turn it around. But they're being taken out and they're being arrested. It was a raid that was caught on camera. NYPD did everything by the book. And some of these guys are accused of murder. So the people that are innocent living there are happy that they're out of their hair. And all it takes is that one blue check mark to quote the tweet.
It's always a blue check mark, right?
It's always a blue check mark. Quotes it and says, nice to know you're doing PR work to her for the NYPD. And he goes into this whole, and I'm thinking to myself, and I didn't comment because I stay out of it. I try to keep my head down, especially on Twitter. But I said to myself, and I texted her, did he even watch the story? Not only that, does he live there? And did he talk to the residents of this particular house to see how they feel? No, but because he's got a big following, even though he doesn't know jack about this particular situation, it took off and she's getting dragged. And I told her, I'm like, listen, I know you're feeling down right now, but like you said to that commander, you did the right thing. And they don't know.
The saddest part about this story, I mean, there are so many sad parts about it. But for me, the sad part about the story is I hope this reporter doesn't think twice now before she writes something. And you mentioned, you don't put a lot of stuff on Twitter. It's a very sad, a byproduct of this, right? Because we're all a lot more hesitant. And I can tell you personally about myself, if you think people hate the NYPD, then wait till you meet the people who hate Israel. And they're pretty much, they pretty much overlap. So I get a lot of it from both ends. And, they always exaggerate my role in both agencies or organizations. They would say like, oh, Yael is like a mouthpiece for the NYPD. And I'm like, I didn't know I was that important.
That's an honor.
But and it really does hurt. And for many years, or at least when I was with NYPD, I didn't talk about Israel stuff, even though it's very dear to my heart and my family's there. But I'm like, I don't want to draw attention. And I reached a point, over the summer during the war where, and again, this is maybe just from experience or being surrounded by people who care about me and can help me with this stuff, where I was more outspoken. And I'm glad I was. And did I draw heat or fire? Sure. But as long as you stand behind what you say and you treat others with respect when you can, but you believe what you say, you believe your truth, then I think it's important to put it out there. And it's sad that the byproduct of this whole craziness on social media is that we're all just afraid to say what's on our mind.
Yeah, because there's an old saying that there's always a main character every day on Twitter. Your goal is just to never be it,
Oh yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's usually not for the right reasons.
There's a
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
great book. Oh, sorry. There's a great book that I really recommend if you haven't read, or for your viewers. It's called So You've Been Publicly Shamed.
Mhm.
And I always get his name wrong. So his name is either Ron Johnson or John Ronson, whoever is not the senator. But if you Google the book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, it's very funny and it's very insightful, and it talks about people who have been kind of in the spotlight for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. You left Yael Baltorres, I guess, during the Mike Commandman podcast. You left the NYPD really right before the craziest year it's had
Yeah.
in a long time. I think this century, obviously 2001, 2002 is probably the toughest year they've had for much different reasons. But the ACAB movement started. And for my older listeners who are wondering, what the heck is ACAB? ACAB is something that people who are anti-cops say on social media, which stands for all cops, and I quote, all cops are bastards. And it started after Mr. Floyd's tragic death last year. So that's going on. There's the clips that people are saying, that either, there's no context to them. This officer shoved me here. And maybe he was wrong for that. And if he is, well, then there's an investigation and he or she gets punished, because you don't want to do that. Like that woman that got shoved in Brooklyn, that didn't look good at all. There's other instances like where we see an officer pulled out his gun. We didn't know what happened before that. Turned out his lieutenant almost got killed by a brick, and he was defending his lieutenant in that instance. So I bet when this is going on, you were probably like, because you wanted to be at the forefront, trying to help turn the tide at least somewhat. So just from an outsider's perspective, watching what those formerly in your position, or in your position that you were in formerly, I should say, had to go through trying to get a good message out there during so much negativity at the height of everything last summer. I guess take me through that and what you would have done had you been in that position.
Yeah, it was really, really tough to watch it. And of course, I'm in touch with a lot of people there, and I know it still isn't an easy time. The one thing that was very clear is that we were to not to have any more fun. So anything we did before, we were trying to have fun once in a while. We did a pizza exchange with Chicago PD. We traded jokes with, did a lot of like fun things on social media. So that was all gone. And it was really tough. It was a bit of a relief not to be in the turmoil and be able to do it, kind of work with my clients or work with people on an individual basis to help them through it, because frankly, there's no police department in the whole country that was exempt from this, right? But it's a very, very tough time. I don't know the answer. In a large organization like NYPD, and also for my colleagues from LAPD, it is usually in the height of these types of, crises where you actually probably get less people doing social media because manpower is needed elsewhere. So not only are you dealing with one of the most challenging scenarios that you could deal with in terms of public image, but also you're probably doing it with less hands on deck. And then, like you said, you get to a point where every single thing you say is turned against you. So, for example, the example you gave about the takedown of the gangs in the public housing, there was a time where that would be very positive. Like people would be like, oh, good, great, thank you, and kind of see that how this is helpful to the communities in that area. But you lose just a lot of that, a faith that people have in you, whether rightfully or not. I think a lot of it is in error. But when you lose that faith, everything you put out there, even the positive things, are misconstrued. And it's very tough because at the end of the day, there are men and women behind these uniforms, right? Mm-hmm. And same with the keyboards, the people who are running social media. A lot of them are police officers themselves. they're getting, very, very discouraged, and it's very difficult for them to show the side of the NYPD that they love and they respect and they're part of, without getting, just negative feedback from all over. So it's tough.
I imagine. And even because there's no boundaries with it too, and you can say really whatever you want virtually without any repercussions. Because I remember, like, we can both agree 9/11 is a very sacred day, and the NYPD has this thing where they will tweet out the photos of the officers not just killed on that day, but those who have since passed away from 9/11 related illnesses. And I made the mistake of checking the quote tweets on one. This was an officer who was killed on 9/11. Here's somebody that ran down the World Trade Center to save other people as everybody else was running away, and he did not come home. And I'm not even going to give this person any credit or anything like that. It's just a really mean tweet about somebody who, A, is not allowed to defend themselves, and B, had you been in that situation, would have ran in there to save you.
Yeah.
And something like that, I'm not even a cop, but as someone who has family that is, and is friends with many who were and are, that, you're right, it is a tough time, because at the end of the day, we're all human. And if you have a conscience, that kind of stuff boils your blood to where it's very hard not to go right back at that person and be like, all right, but again, you realize the long-term cost. I could eviscerate this person right now. I could roast them right back. But what good does it do?
Yeah, it's tough. I always ask myself if I want to respond to negativity and to trolls, and sometimes I do, and I regret it. A lot of times I kind of take a deep breath. I think at least my way of dealing sometimes is just shining a light on the ridiculousness of it. So, I like to use humor, and if I manage to somehow say something funny that will show how ridiculous someone's take is, I feel like I've done my part. But just to be mean for the sake of being mean, I think a lot of people get really, really caught up in it. And there are a lot of nasty, weird, crazy people out there, and you try to ignore them. It does take a different meaning when you see somebody say something awful and stupid, and you're like, who wrote this? Like a 15-year-old? And you go and you check their profile, and they're like, contributing editor for CNN. Really? Like, I think I just saw one of those today. So that's when it gets, I think, just a little more alarming to me. But unfortunately, everything you do, everything you say, even if you show the most positive thing, there's going to be somebody out there, usually with their own set of problems, that will take offense to it.
I will say, you have your own social media consulting company now, which is doing very well, because a lot of law enforcement agencies could use these tips both in big cities and small ones alike. But, it's a great job. It's a great department with a lot of great people who you're still friends with, as you were just saying. What made you leave the NYPD?
So actually, it was kind of interesting. It was a little unexpected, but my visa ran out. So I'm not a US citizen, and my visa ran out. It expired on January 2nd. And honestly, I think it maybe was a sort of a blessing in disguise, because I was happy to move on, even though I miss it a lot. But what happened after is that I got my green card, and as of January this year, January 2021, I became a permanent resident, so a green card holder. Super, super exciting. I don't know if people know what the immigration process is like, but I basically here for 14 years on a work visa, which meant that, or I was on different visas, but it meant that my entire stay in the US was based on my affiliation or my employment, and my workplace was written in my passport. And to be able to have a green card and be, feel one step closer to being American, and being able to be hired by anyone, is just some incredible freedom. So I think it was a good and positive step. And I, definitely hold a very special place in my heart for the New York City Police Department.
Absolutely, as do I. I mean, even though this show is very eclectic in doing sports interviews and news interviews, it's a New York City centric show, and it's not what it is. And it's made a lot of headway recently in the last year. And I'm very proud of that. But the reason why it's made headway is because of my interviews with the FDNY members and the NYPD members. You know, that department, both departments have given a lot to me in terms of the people I've been able to speak to, yourself included. And it's for me, it's the greatest city in the world, and it has the greatest fire department, the greatest police department in the world, doing the work that goes unsung. It's not what you see, as Ray Kelly used to say, it's what you don't see.
Yeah.
And it's important to chronicle that whenever you can. So just one last note before I get to the concluding segment, and it's really flown by. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have as well. You do a lot of work with our mutual friend, Nancy Ronald on Colón Media. You were just on there the other day. I mean, she is a wild card, and I mean that in a good way. So working with them, I guess, you're out there. It's a good platform to further explain your expertise on these matters on. But nonetheless, given your social media consulting company, given your work with Paloma, what are your goals for the future? Do you want to be that talking head on television someday? Do you want to continue to expand your company? I'm sure you do, obviously. What's in the future for Yael Beltour?
That's a great question. I met Nancy about a year ago. In November, we were just talking about that. And I had never really had journalist friends before. In fact, I didn't really like them. I've always been very wary of journalists. And I met Nancy, and she opened up a whole new world to me, and through some podcasts that we listened to, and met a lot of her friends. And that was actually the first time that I became more comfortable voicing my opinions publicly, through her YouTube channel, and then through Twitter as well. Before that, I was very much kind of, as a city employee, not stating any of my extremely moderate political opinions publicly. So I would like to continue doing that. I would also like to continue helping police departments out as much as I can. It is my passion. My goal is, to have enough money doing something so that I can just help police departments pro bono, because a lot of them, they don't necessarily can't necessarily pay for these services, but they really, really need them. But I also, I do enjoy speaking publicly. I'm about to launch a podcast soon with a friend who is a Hasidic Jew, which is a world that I know very little about, as a secular Israeli. So we're going to launch a podcast. We've recorded a few episodes where we talk about, different aspects, different items of the day from our different unique experiences. And we'll see what the future holds.
All right, sounds good. And that brings us now to the concluding segment of the Mike in New Haven podcast. As always, as the listeners know already, it's rapid fire, 5 hit and run questions for me, 5 answers for me. Are you ready?
Okay, let's go.
All right, first, favorite neighborhood in New York City?
Well, I'm biased. I have to say the Upper West Side, where I live.
All right, no problem with that. Second, funniest colleagues you ever worked with?
Funniest colleagues I ever worked with? Wow. Pretty much everybody in my digital communications unit at NYPD. I can't repeat any of the jokes that we would say because we would all get fired, but it's just the funniest group.
We'll say allegedly. Third, favorite bar or restaurant in Israel?
In Israel. So my parents live next to the Carmel Market, the open air market in Tel Aviv. And any little place that you go to in the Carmel Market and grab like a shawarma or falafel, you'll be good to go.
Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Oh, in New York City. Let's say for people who are visiting, let's say McSorley's. If you've never been in New York City, it is one of the oldest bars. I think it's from the 1800s. Pretty much everybody that works there used to work there in the 1800s. And it's an amazing piece of history. Highly recommend it. Just something out of a different era. Very, very cool place. McSorley's.
Fifth and finally, what advice would you give to anyone looking to enter your profession?
Anybody looking to enter my profession, take care of yourself. Don't get too sucked in to social media. It is not real life. The people on social media do not represent the majority of the public. They don't represent public opinion. You're just getting a segment of it. So just keep that in mind and make sure to, keep a firm grasp on the world out there and not get too too sucked into the virtual one.
As the legendary Marshawn Lynch once said, protect y'all's chicken and y'all's mentals. So
I love it.
yes, that's a great line from a great running back who I loved watching growing up. So that concludes what's been another really fun episode of the show. I'm thankful that you came on. I appreciate you making the time for me. Before we go, any plugs or shout outs you want to give?
No, please check out my my Twitter account, YaelBT, my website, yaelbartour.com. You can reach out to me if you need help with social media, any department, big or small. You don't need a social media unit or, you know, more than one person really to create a great presence. So reach out and I'd be happy to help.
On my end, Twitter, Mike in New Haven, Instagram, original_MC1, and of course, LinkedIn, Mike Colón, and then just type in Mike Colón after my name, MIC_D, so you can connect with me and differentiate from any other Mike Colóns that may be out there. There's only one with the podcast.
I don't have that problem, see?
So, yeah, there you go, because your name's unique. Of course, YouTube, MC's audio, MC_S audio, if you want to subscribe and see the video version of this podcast. And if you want to listen to the audio version, we'll then go to Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else that you get your podcast. Coming up with the Mike New Haven podcast, 4 very interesting guests. Retired NYPD homicide detective, author, and adjunct professor Al Titus will be here November 8th, November 9th. Speaking of journalists, Rocco Paris-Candola, Police Bureau Chief of the New York Daily News. November 15th, this one I'm really looking forward to. We'll get back to the sports aspect of the podcast. The legendary Bob Costas, great broadcaster, will be here. And November 16th will be customs agent, retired customs agent Lorenzo Toledo, who was working in Jersey, who was working in Miami, bringing down drug dealers, corrupt officials, and everything else in between. So looking forward to those shows as we sprint towards the end of the year, which shows that I hope you will enjoy as much as I'm sure I will. So in the meantime, on behalf of Yael Bartour, I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.